Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Westdale Theatre Classic Film Series Talks. My name is Jeff Bender, and in a moment we will begin our third discussion of And the Oscar Goes To, a program that puts the spotlight on five rarely discussed films that won the Best Picture award in the past. Tonight we take a look back at 1946's The Best Years of Our Lives, directed by William Wyler. But first, just a couple of notes before we get started for those who are just joining us for the first time. The Westdale is a gorgeous cinema from 1935 and serves as the hub of the community that delivers art house and classic film programming, but also lends a stage to musicians to share their talents and tell their stories in the lecture series, The Hamilton Originals, hosted by Mike McCurley, as well as developing several virtual programs like the talks you've been experiencing on Monday nights. If you wish to find out more about past programs, including viewing some of Fred's past film talks, we encourage you to visit our website at www.thewestdale.ca. And of course, if you enjoy programs like these, please consider leaving a donation. It's definitely greatly appreciated. On a final note, during Fred's talk, if you have any questions you'd like him to discuss, please feel free to access the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen and type it there. During the conversation, if I see some questions that are similar in nature, I'll combine them for Fred to ensure we can get as many questions as time allows in. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Chairperson of the Board of Directors at the Westdale, executive producer of several motion pictures and productions over his long career, and a man who's experienced the Academy Awards ceremony up close and backstage, Mr. Fred Fuchs. Good evening, Fred.
Good evening. Thank you, Jeffrey. Hi, everybody. This is a very exciting evening for me. The Best Years of My Lives is one of my absolutely favorite films of all time, and I'll tell you a little bit about why. And it's something I always look forward to screening at the Westdale. Unfortunately, we did not have a chance to do that before we had to be closed, because obviously it's a remarkable film, photography, everything about it. I unfortunately couldn't have that experience for you on the big screen, but maybe one day we will. And one of the reasons this film means so much to me is that I sort of have a personal connection to it, because I was born in New York in 1954, and my father was in the Army. He was actually in the Army Air Corps, which preceded the Air Force. And growing up on Long Island, all my friends' fathers had been in the war. That was the generation that they were, and we were the result, the baby boomers, in the early 50s. And the impact on the war that the war had on our fathers was actually very, very visible. Certainly, and most importantly, things like the GI Bill provided for education. So a lot of these men who were from poor families, a lot of them Jewish, from Lower East Side of New York, were able to get educations and go to college and became doctors and lawyers. And in my case, my father was an economist. He was a professor. And then also they were able to afford housing. And where I lived was very much that kind of new surveys being built out on Long Island and being financed, partially through the GI Bill. And then also, of course, the veterans provided medical care. And some of my father's friends even had memorabilia. I can remember going into their study when I was 5 years old and seeing some kind of a sword or something like that. But not unlike this film, none of them ever really wanted to talk about what they did. And I never really understood that. I couldn't figure out it was because they were just being, shy, or they didn't want to brag. But talking about the war itself and what you did was just not something they did and not something they talked about with their kids. When this film came out in 1945, and of course it was 46 when it won the Academy Award, there's never been a motion picture which was so wholly and enthusiastically endorsed. And one of the critics from the New York Times says, "Not only is this superlative entertainment, but as food for quiet and humanizing thought. In working out their solutions, Mr. Sherwood, the screenwriter, and Mr. Wyler, the director, have achieved some of the most beautiful and inspiring demonstrations of human fortitude that we have ever had in films." And of course, he called the casting the best performance in this best film this year from Hollywood. And this critic was not alone. This film went on to win 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director and Best Actor for Fredric March, Best Screenplay, etc. And it was the highest grossing film, both in the United States and UK, since the release of Gone with the Wind. And I think it was still, for many years, was one of the top 3 or 4 grossing films of all time. So not just a critical success, but a huge commercial success as well. One of the things that I'm very curious, and we could talk about later, is the title of the film. What did they really mean, and what did they intend with the best years of our lives? And I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts were. The original book that the screenplay was based on was not called The Best Years of Our Lives. It was called Glory for Me. And in 1989, when the Library of Congress decided to first start to select films to be preserved for cultural, historical, and aesthetically significance, this was one of the first 25 films that were chosen to be honored and to be protected for all this time. The movie itself started as actually a recommendation from the producer, Samuel Goldwyn's wife, who had read a Time magazine article called The Way Home in 1944. And it was about different Marines who were having difficulty readjusting to life after returning home from the war. Remember, the war didn't end, of course, until 45. So Goldwyn thought this sounded quite interesting, and he hired a very famous writer and novelist called McKinley Cantor, who was also a journalist, and he had actually been part of the war, and he had flown with the Air Force and the Royal Air Force, and a brilliant writer. He wound up winning a Pulitzer Prize in 1955 for an incredible Civil War novel called Andersonville. And anyhow, he used these stories, The Way Home, and he was asked to sort of write, a loose fictional adaptation of about 100 pages. About a month later, Cantor turned in a 300-page novel written in verse. And Goldwyn was a little disappointed, and he kind of shelved the project, didn't know what he was going to do. But William Wyler, the director, had also just returned from the war. He had been in the Air Force. He had received an honorable discharge as a colonel. He had also received the Legion of Merit Award. And we'll talk a little bit about Wyler's war career. And Wyler got hold of this and had been working with Sam Goldwyn, on many of his great films, and sort of said, I want to do this. And this became the most important film of Wyler's career. Now, Wyler himself, of course, was one of the top Hollywood directors. He received his first Oscar nomination for Dodsworth in 1936. He was absolute perfectionist. He was known for lots of retakes, looking for every nuance in his performances. He did a lot of great literary classics that he adapted, and always very bankable, and he continued on into the 1960s with movies like Funny Girl, etc. And he was also known for editing and camera movement. And, William Wyler is not necessarily talked about as much as you might hear John Ford's name, or Billy Wilder, or Howard Hawks, or, some of the other more auteur directors. But he really was the consummate director. And if you look at the list of his films, they're just amazing. 14 actors won Oscars under one, not just nominated, including Bette Davis and Jezebel and The Letter. And even Bette Davis, who was one tough cookie, said, "It was Wyler who helped me realize my full potential as an actress. I met my match in this exceptionally creative and talented director." Yeah, you didn't hear that from Bette Davis about very many people. And it just went on and on. Audrey Hepburn in Roman Holiday, and Streisand in Funny Girl, Olivia de Havilland. And he himself received 12 Oscar nominations for Best Director, which is absolutely incredible. And of course, his films, more nominations than any director. And Wyler's story is very important because it really did influence how this film came together. And Wyler was a Polish Jew, very, very poor family, didn't know what to do in Europe, managed to make his way into America in around 1921. He was probably 19 years old. He happened to meet Carl Laemmle, who was the head of Universal, another Jewish immigrant. They had someone in common. And next thing you know, at 19, he was working on the sets as a swingman, never went to film school, really grew up on the film set. By the time he was 1925, he was the youngest director. He was doing silent films, one-reelers, Westerns, really learning his craft, by practice, and became a US citizen by 1928. And then he did hook up with Samuel Goldwyn, one of the greatest producers of all time. He and David O. Selznick were really the only two producers who were truly independent of the studio system and were able to make the movies they wanted to make and finance them. They still distributed through the system, through the studios, but they really, had their own contracts with directors and actors and really functioned as mini studios. Again, unbelievable movies, Wuthering Heights, I don't know if you're the Westerners, I mentioned Dodsworth. And it was also during this period of time in the 30s that he began to collaborate with the cinematographer Greg Toland. And now, if that name sounds familiar, of course, Greg Toland was the cinematographer who worked with Orson Welles on Citizen Kane. So, and many of the things that they did on Citizen Kane, which people thought were being done for the first time, actually were being done in these Toland and Wyler movies. One of them, of course, is the famous Deep Focus, which I think, if you remember us talking about this in the past, but basically what that means is the idea that you could create multiple layers of action within one scene, and therefore you didn't have to cut a lot. You can play scenes in a big master shot. And anyhow, all of this really was developed by Wyler and Toland, not completely just by Orson Welles. Then in 1943, he made a very important movie called Mrs. Miniver with Greer Garson and Walter Pidgeon. And this was a story about the suffering of British citizens right before the Americans joined the war. And in fact, the film was almost, many feel had a great influence on the US ultimately joining the war effort. And it was shown during the darkest days in England. And it was, a very intense experience for Wyler to see, the impact a film could have on an audience. And so, and of course it was banned by the Nazis, it was banned by the Hayes office. People like Joseph Kennedy, who was the US ambassador to the United Kingdom, told him, oh, this can't be released, and because he was, that's a whole nother story. Anyhow, it did come out, did not make a lot of money, but it did win 6 Academy Awards, top box office hit in 1942, first nomination, and Churchill, in fact, sent a telegram to Louis B. Mayer saying, Mrs. Miniver is propaganda worth 100 battleships. Now, during the war, Wyler volunteered and became involved in producing documentaries. And he made some very important documentaries. One of them was called The Memphis Belle, about the bomber planes. He really lived through the war in a very, personal way. And he got to understand what the mood of the nation was as it started to turn to peace after the war. And he had his own experience of having to come home after being away and reunite with his wife and family. So the idea of, a story of these 3 veterans coming back from World War II, dramatizing the problems of the adjusting to civilian life, was a very, very personal film for him, and really impacted not just, of course, his own life, but so many people who saw it. And during the war, of course, he also was exposed to a different type of filmmaking with this sort of documentary style. And one of the things I'm sure you noticed in the film is it doesn't really always feel like a Hollywood studio movie, that there is a sort of documentary quality to it. There is a sort of a realism to it. One of the things Wyler said is the war had been an escape into reality. Only relationships with people who might be dead tomorrow were important. So really changed his life. And again, there was a movement afoot in the film world, especially in Italy. They called it neorealism, Open City, The Bicycle Thief, this idea of telling stories that weren't documentaries, but done in a much more kind of realistic style with very natural performances. If you look at the best years of our lives, you look at the clothing, the costumes were all bought off the rack. The actors wore their clothes for 2 or 3 weeks before shooting started to make sure that they looked lived in and appropriate for what they did. The sets themselves were sometimes even smaller than they might normally have been. There was a real effort to present this film in that kind of more realistic way. So Cantor, of course, that glory for me, but it was Wyler's idea to bring in the Pulitzer Prize playwright Robert Sherwood. And again, Sherwood was the greatest writer of the time. He won Pulitzer Prizes. He was also a speechwriter for President Roosevelt. He worked with the Secretary of War and the Secretary of Navy, and they really, wanted to do something special. So they took this book, Glory for Me, but they made a number of changes in it before it actually became a screenplay. It was still, based on these 3 soldiers returning. Boone City is more or less modeled on Cincinnati, a Midwest town, and that was near where Cantor grew up. And then, of course, Fred Derry, the Air Force, Al Stevenson, the Army, and then, of course, Harold Russell, the seaman. So all 3 parts of the armed forces were represented. And of course, they chose 3 characters from different economic stratospheres to show how this really affected everybody. Some of the big changes was certainly the change in Homer's character. And we'll talk about Harold Russell and how he was cast, because in the book, it was not a amputee. Harold had other issues. He was an alcoholic. He was a spastic. But Harold got actually cast in a very unusual way, because Wyler was looking at a documentary that had been made during the war. I forget what it was called, something about a sergeant, and it starred Harold Russell, because Harold Russell actually had been in the services, and he had been training paratroopers, and there was a munition explosion, and he lost both his hands, and he was given those hooks and trained how to use those hooks. And Wyler happened to see this documentary and was so fascinated by this guy, who was not a professional actor, that he decided to cast him in this very major part, and of course change the character to one who was had this double amputee, and many other changes. When Fred comes home, Dana Andrews, he catches Marie in an affair, and they get divorced very early on. Obviously, so much more poignant that they, tried to make a marriage work and ultimately fell apart. So lots of changes as usually happen, but nevertheless, between Wyler and Sherwood, they came up with this absolutely extraordinary thing. So, and again, Wyler was really committed to realism, and that demanded such a clear arc for these character stories, and not sort of just happy endings, and created lots of interesting drama. In fact, in the book, Al Stevenson quits his job at the bank and starts drinking and gets involved in alcoholism. But many of these scenes, and we'll talk about some of them more specifically later. Again, when you think about some of the early scenes, the aerial photography at the beginning of the plane bringing the soldiers home, very documentary kind of quality to that. The use of the deep focus we talked about, and I'll give you some examples when we go through some of the different images of what actually happened there. So, there's sort of this underlying sadness, and remember, Roosevelt had just died as well. And there were a lot of challenges to America going on, the labor unrest as the soldiers returned home. Remember, women had been working and had taken over a lot of these jobs. And suddenly women were being told, no, you shouldn't work anymore, like Marie, and you're supposed to stay home and don't take jobs away from the soldiers. Unemployment was rampant, and 50% of the people unemployed were soldiers and ex-servicemen. There was this sort of looming threat that they even touch on in the film about, the devastation of the atomic bomb, and that although, that the war has ended, there's not real peace, and that this alliance with Russia had already started to unravel. Even sort of the threat of consumerism. If you look at, Bullard's drugstore and how it had been taken over by a chain, and now it was, selling toys and cosmetics and perfumes, and, and just trying to, I think there's a comment, in fact, that Al says to Millie last year, it was kill the Japs. Now it's make money. So, lots of stuff like this was richly layered into this film, and I think was quite remarkable. Sherwood, again, I can't even, what a brilliant dialogue. There's so much, but he was part of that famous Algonquin Round Table, in New York with Dorothy Parker, Robert Benchley, and he was a very unusual guy, 6'8". And he worked a little bit in other films. In fact, he was involved in writing the screenplay for Rebecca in 1940. But he's the one who came up with this title, The Best Years of Our Lives, and really was, with Wyler, responsible for this incredible screenplay. Now, I have to touch on, of course, on Sam Goldwyn, the producer, who originally known as Samuel Goldfish. He was a Jewish immigrant from Poland. Now, he came over much earlier. He tried to get into business. He actually had a glove factory for a while, but it was very difficult for these immigrants because, of course, there was, they couldn't become bankers. They couldn't go to law school. They couldn't even go to medical school, right? So they had to find their own way, and they had to find their own industry. And it turned out it was the film industry. And many of them started in distribution with the Nickelodeons. Goldfish in 1913 became partners with Jesse Lasky, he was related to through marriage. He was 34 years old at the time, and they formed something called Paramount, which is still around. In 1916, he left Paramount, and he started working with a guy named Edgar Selwyn, and they started another company called Goldwyn Pictures that actually later on merged with Marcus Lowe and Metro Pictures and became Metro Goldwyn Mayer, MGM. That was in 1924. So Samuel Goldwyn actually was part of forming both Paramount and MGM, though he was never involved in any of the production of either studio. And his only connection was he had the trademark for Wheel the Lion, which of course became the very famous trademark for MGM. But over his 35 years, he really had an incredible eye for talent, working with people like William Wyler and other great writers, and very successful. And he worked with, John Ford, lots of the best. And he kind of ran his own studio where he would, put writers under contract. He would, hire actors and train them and keep them under contract. Several of the actors in this were under contract to Goldwyn, and that's why they were cast. And he was also very famous for his malapropisms, speech errors. He would say just extraordinary things. I don't think anybody should write his autobiography until after he's dead. And very include me out. A verbal contract isn't worth the paper it's written on. And the harder I work, the luckier I get. And then, of course, his most famous one was, if you want to send a message, call Western Union. But of course, he didn't call Western Union. He sent a message with this film, and it was a very significant message, I think. Tragedy of the war was William Wyler lost his hearing. He was nearly deaf by the time he came back from the war. And he had some concerns whether his career was over and if he was even going to be able to be a director again. But the cinematographer, Greg Tolan, rigged a special system, and Wyler had headphones that he would have to listen through to even hear the actors, performing, so he could direct them. I can't even imagine how this was possible, but he did figure out how to do it, and he did continue to do it for another 20 years. Maybe some of his hearing came back. The cast, of course, is, one of the greatest ever put together. We'll start with Myrna Loy. So Myrna Loy got top billing, even though she wasn't, really the biggest, the biggest part. But Millie Stevenson, Al's wife, but she was the biggest actress of that group and the highest paid of that group. And Myrna Loy had starred in silent films, and she had been around for quite a long time, even though she was only 38 when the film was made. In fact, her daughter, Teresa Wright, was only 13 years younger than her. But, it's a movie. So, but Myrna Loy was mostly famous as a great femme fatale and a vamp because of her sort of exotic look, even though she was an American and kind of grew up in Los Angeles. But everyone thought she was very exotic and was often cast in these strange, The Desert Song and Crimson City and The Mask of Fu Manchu. So, people thought she was Asian. I don't know what. But in 1934, she was cast, of course, as Nora Charles in The Thin Man with William Powell. And that film became an enormous success and really showed her wit and her humor and just sort of her grace. And I just think in this movie, she's just extraordinary. And without that much to do and that many great, lines of dialogue, but you just think about her looks and her presence, and particularly, of course, in that great banquet scene when Al's making his drunken speech and she's checking off, how many drinks he had. And so there was, once that became a big hit, she was really on her way. And in fact, she and William Powell were in 14 films together, one of the most prolific pairings in history. And Loy's famous line is, after The Thin Man she made the film, she said, "That finally made me after more than 80 films." So she never won an Academy Award. She was never considered the greatest actress, but at the same time, she was very involved in politics. And she had a very influential role. She was co-chairman, and this is in the 1950s now, of the Advisory Council of the National Committee Against Discrimination in Housing. She became one of the first Hollywood celebrity members of UNESCO. She fought tooth and nail against McCarthyism and all of the various things going on in the 50s, and someone who continued to work quite into her life. Fredric March, of course, her husband, Al Stevenson. It's so ironic. Of course, he was a platoon sergeant, being the banker. He was 47 at the time, so I'm not exactly sure how that worked. But March he's really like the American Laurence Olivier. There's nothing that this guy couldn't do. And he did historical characters. He did, comedy. He won the Best Actor at the 5th Academy Awards in 1932 for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Great comedies, Designed for Living. Played with Greta Garbo, and Anna Karenina. He was the original Norman Maine in A Star is Born, with Janet Gaynor. That was his 3rd Academy Award nomination. And he's the only one of 2 actors, and the other one being Helen Hayes. I could have made this a trivia question, but who's won 2 Academy Awards and 2 Tonys. And incredibly accomplished actor. Dana Andrews is also an amazing actor who really never got the recognition that I think he probably deserved. And he was absolutely fantastic in this role. He was only 35. And he was someone that Sam Goldwyn had spotted and put under contract and developed and had him work at the Pasadena Playhouse. And he would loan him out, for different parts, not necessarily just Goldwyn movies. He was in a great John Ford movie called Tobacco Road. And then, of course, one of his greatest movies was the Oxbow Incident in 1943. I don't know if you guys know that movie with Henry Fonda. He plays the lynching victim. And it's absolutely an extraordinary performance. Again, did not get much recognition. You probably remember, of course, from our film noir, movie Laura in 1944. So that was literally, a year and a half before. And he also worked with Preminger on that great film I've mentioned before called Fallen Angel. So he went on to do a lot of wonderful things. But of course, his performance in The Best Years of Our Lives is probably what he's best known for. And in a way, he really was sort of I would have to say, the lead of this ensemble piece. Teresa Wright as the daughter, Peggy Stevenson, what an amazing actress. So she was nominated twice for the Best Supporting Actor in 1941 for Little Foxes, and then I forget the other, and then in 1942 for Mrs. Miniver, and then for the Pride of the Yankees opposite Gary Cooper. So here was a young actress, her first 3 performances were all nominated for Academy Awards. That's the only time that's ever happened. You might also remember her from Alfred Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt in 1943, where she plays, the young, and she played young for quite a while. She must have been, again, I guess she was, mid-20s, by the time she played this part. Virginia Mayo, Marie Derry, I mean, all of these were big stars. Again, a Samuel Goldwyn contract player, very big box office success. She was a dancer, and she was Danny Kaye's partner in all those great musicals he did in the 40s. And she was probably one of the biggest, most successful box office stars. And I found watching the movie this time, her very interesting, very sympathetic character, and could have been, so over the top and kind of, one note. But she really touched on something with this, effect on women after the war, and, and what their expectations were for when the servicemen came back, and when they came back and they had changed and were suffering from PTSD and everything. Very, very interesting performance, a very beautifully written character, I thought. And then, of course, Kathy O'Donnell, who played Wilma. Again, under contract from Goldwyn, he developed her. She had a few small parts. She did a great run on Broadway in Life with Father. But of course, playing against, Homer, some of those scenes, particularly the one we'll talk about, which is when she's putting him to bed at night, I think are some of the greatest, scenes ever done. And a relatively inexperienced actress, but who just had this great natural quality and empathy. Her other great film, of course, was They Live by Night in 1948, the great Nick Ray film noir with Farley Granger. Another quick appearance was Hoagy Carmichael as Butch, the piano player who owned the bar. I don't know if you guys know who Hoagy Carmichael was, but he was one of the absolute top, composers and musicians of his time. He wrote Stardust, Georgia on My Mind, The Nearness of You, Heart and Soul. These are like the most recorded American songs of all time. His own singing voice was not the greatest, though he did sing, but mostly it was other people who made these songs famous. And he appeared in a number of different movies, obviously including this one. He was also the piano player in To Have and Have Not. I don't know if you remember with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall's first film. There's a little scene with the guy playing some music. It's Hoagy Carmichael. And then he won an Academy Award, later on, the cool of the evening. So quite an extraordinary guy. And I think his role, as Butch, and his relationship, of course, with Homer, just again brought this kind of authenticity and naturalness to the movie that very hard to duplicate with just acting performances. And of course, the scene of them playing chopsticks together is another classic we'll talk about. Lastly, of course, Harold Russell. Now, Harold Russell was a Canadian. He was born in North Sydney, Nova Scotia. But he did move to the States when he was about 10, and he did work, in the Army. He was an instructor in the Airborne. He did lose his hands. Again, he was in this wonderful training film about rehabilitating war, and this is how he wound up getting the part. And of course, he did win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. And he's the only, that's not true, there's one other non-professional actor who ever won an Academy Award for acting. And that was a Vietnamese actor named Hang S. Nguyen, who was in a film called The Killing Fields. I don't know if you guys remember that film or not, but he won the Academy Award for. So they, Wyler just decided, I'm putting this guy in this movie. He was so moved by him. And Sam Goldwyn thought, oh, great idea. We'll send him for some acting classes. And when Wyler found out, he was furious. He didn't want him to have any acting classes. He didn't want him to do anything, except just be the natural character he was. And of course, there's so many memorable scenes, and he's so fantastic in this film. And one of the great ironies is that everybody knew about this performance in this film. So the Academy decided to give him an honorary award for bringing hope and courage to his fellow veterans through his appearance, because they thought very unlikely they would actually win the Best Supporting Actor award. But nevertheless, he won that as well. And he's the only actor in the history of Hollywood to receive 2 Academy Awards for the same performance. We'll go through the slides in a minute, but actually, maybe this is as good a time as any to do that. So do you want to put up the slides and we can talk a little more about some specific scenes? Thank you, Jeff. Okay, hold on. Let me put this in a better view for me. Okay, here we go. So here we go at the introduction of the 3 characters, of course, representing each of the different branches of the service. A captain, Fred Derry, of course, who is probably from the poorest family, and then the banker, Sergeant Al Stevenson, and then Petty Officer Homer Parrish, Harold Russell. And I thought this was just an amazing sequence because it did have that kind of documentary-like quality. They had these visual effects shots of them flying over these various parts of town. The town itself was Cincinnati. They shot those plates in Cincinnati of the field and other things like that. And it's just sort of a wonderful little introduction to the characters, watching them bonding together, talking about their fears of arriving home or what's changed, and kind of extraordinary. It gives you that sense of camaraderie that perhaps was part of what people developed in the Army when they were in close quarters with these and everything was life and death, and I just thought it set up this movie so beautifully. Again, this movie does not rush along. It's 3 hours, right? It takes its time. And I think that's one of the beauties of this film, is that you're able to just kind of relax and not worry. I don't think nothing really happens in this movie, right? It all happens about 3 weeks, and there's no big huge events per se, or nobody gets killed, or but I think it really did something very special for the audience to give them the kind of this big scope of of what the life would be. And of course, as a triptych, the opportunity to have to explore each of the characters' lives was going to take time. And then we see the next slide is Homer being dropped off at his house. Great moment of him saluting his fellow officers. You can see his mom kind of weeping and just, happy he's home, but seeing these hooks for the first time. And then, of course, we see Wilma behind him. And I think there's a great line from Fred after Wilma goes to hug him, something about, you can teach, so many things to a soul, but you can't teach him how to hug his girl, without his hands. Great moments. Next slide. So this kind of actually happened to William Wyler. This was him, going home and he describes, this long kind of, again, this is a beautiful shot, deep focus shot where, his wife is appearing down this long hallway after he greets his kids. And so again, there's no cut to a close-up, there's no cut back to a reaction shot. This is all sort of played in these beautiful long shots. And And I think that's that's just a great filmmaking. It's great direction. And here we are with the family. And I've never quite understood why Rob sort of just disappears after the first third of the film, but maybe they couldn't figure out what else to do with him. But he does have sort of a couple of fun moments where he's talking to his dad about the future and, and atomic energy. And next slide, please. I'm sorry, this is the slide of the happy family with Teresa Wright. Next slide. Yeah, so this is Hoagie Carmichael in the back there, and this is, Butch's, bar, and very beautifully done. The set I thought was terrific, and again, lots of these kinds of shots, where you have multiple characters playing out in a single sequence, and again, I think this relationship between, Butch and Homer, obviously was a very important one. And Homer starts to spend more and more time. And as I said in the book, Homer really struggles deeply with alcoholism. I think that got toned down here, and we see other challenges for him. Next scene. Yeah, this, of course, is now Al and Millie have wound up in Butch's. And, we really see, particularly with Myrna Loy, how hard she's trying to, reconnect with her husband, trying to make things work with him, recognizing, intuitively how much he's changed. Obviously, his drinking, does continue, and he becomes, quite a heavy drinker, and you sort of have there's a bit of pathos in this relationship, at least I think, and especially at the end. And although there's a happy ending, you do get the sense that their struggles are going to continue, and his struggles at the bank will continue. Next slide, please. So, this is, of course, an amazing acting performance. This is Fred gets brought home by Peggy, after that night, and we see him suffering his night terrors from the event when his plane was on fire. And again, in those days, they didn't know what PTSD was. What did they call them? Shell shocked, or they had a couple other expressions for what these veterans had experienced. But I don't think there was a deep understanding of how significant it was and how much it was going to affect their lives. And as we talked about in The Lost Weekend, how many became alcoholics, etc. Next shot, please. Yeah, this is a great, again, point of view shot. This is Peggy, as she drops Fred off. He can't even get into his apartment. But look at the beautiful composition of that shot. And again, the deep focus. So allowing you to see, Dana Andrews, see his expression. So you don't have to cut to a close-up of Dana Andrews, the way you would do today or you would do in TV, Next sequence, Virginia Mayo. I mean, she was a real pinup girl. I mean, this was, she was a dancer and quite well known in her day. And this was a very unusual part for her. She normally did not play in dramatic films. She certainly didn't play this type of character before. It was usually a very lighthearted character. But again, look at the set, as very mundane, really contrasting the lifestyle of the of the parishes and the Stevens. Next slide, please. Yeah, and here we go. He's back at this drugstore, where he, had worked, and now it's become this department store. And it's very beautiful how this is directed. You kind of come into the set behind Fred, and you're kind of really experiencing it kind of from his point of view as he comes walking through it, and ultimately goes up to talk to the boss about getting a job. And of course, I do believe there was this commentary going on about, the changes in America and the focus on economic growth and commercialism, and, the small store had to sell out to the chain, and all of that was worked into it. Next slide. Jeff, you okay?
Yep, I'm here. Are you able to see the?
Oh, now I see it. Sorry. Yeah. So again, this is him, the job interview, and again, here was a guy who was making $400 a month, as a captain dropping bombs, and he's, being offered, a job for, $32.50, and again, just a scene that was probably repeated over and over again of, young men who had important jobs, leading people, and of course, returned to get nothing. Now, one thing that isn't touched on, obviously, in this film, and was even a more tragic situation, was the plight of the African American soldiers, who fought in World War II. And there was still segregation. There were Negro squadrons at the time, but many of them did become officers and have important jobs and became somewhat accepted within the service. And of course, when they returned, especially to the South, racism was the same, and they couldn't even use the same bathrooms or, sit on the bus. And I mean, that's a whole nother movie, but, and obviously couldn't fit into this one, but it's another story that was absolutely, even in a way more dramatic than this. Next one, please. So this to me was a great performance moment when we see Homer being teased by the kids, and and he just, the way he reacts, and kind of not he doesn't want to scare the kids, and the rage and anger isn't really with them, it's his own frustration, but the way he uses the hooks to smash the glass, and of course the impact that has on the kids, and I just and that's a great shot. Obviously, you can look at the expression on his face, and he just was so wonderful in this film. I just again, especially with zero, I don't know what William Wyler, how much direction he was given or not, but it all worked so beautifully. Next slide, please. Yep. So this is Fredric March now trying to be a banker, and now, and then this serviceman comes for a loan. And this was, scene had been repeated a million times. And there was this great GI Bill that would kind of, backstop half your mortgage. But, there were all these guys and who were trying to make, get a go. And this guy wanted to become a farmer and no collateral. And I think Al's wonderful in this scene. And of course, he goes ahead and does go forward with a loan, even though, of course, there's, he gets a lot of shit for doing it. Next one, please. Yeah, so this is Peggy and Fred kissing after that first lunch date. I love the composition of this shot. I love the way they're sort of, kind of being pushed together by the cars. Obviously, this was quite, controversial with the production code, because, here was a married man, and kissing this woman, and this was their first date. But it's the passion, the chemistry between these two characters was so evident, and it just felt so believable. And I'm not really sure what happened with the production code, but there seemed to be, and they did continue on and make this scene. And of course, the relationship panned out the way it did. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think, this, speech, this is Fredric March, absolutely at his best. And, the tension, of this moment with especially with Myrna Loy, with Millie tracking the drinks, and you don't know what he's going to say, and he's going to kind of blow up his career, but get fired, and he just does this scene so beautifully. I just felt it was just an absolutely gorgeous moment, one of the best scenes in the film as far as I'm concerned, and probably the scene that got him his Academy Award for Best Actor. Next scene. Again, beautifully directed scene with the mirrors and Peggy and Marie, talking about men. And you can see again with the way it's blocked that you can see Peggy's reactions to what Marie is saying without having to cut the close-ups. I think the entire sequence is played sort of as these 2 or 3 shots. And at first you're not sure, are you looking in the mirror? Is that, or are you seeing a reflection? Or, and it all kind of plays out in a very interesting visual way, and wonderful scene for both of the actors. Next one, please. Yeah, very, again, super powerful scene, so controlled, very, very much, what a great playwright would write. And this is, of course, the scene where Al's telling Fred he can't see Peggy anymore and he's going to ruin her life. And he makes him promise that he'll never see her again because he's married. And of course, Al really doesn't know what's going on with Fred and his wife, but he's trying to protect his daughter in a good way. And then the following scene, again, to me, is one of the highlights of the movie, and this sequence of Homer and Butch playing, chopsticks, right, on the piano. But what's absolutely incredible about this is if you can look and you can see in the distance, you see Fred on the phone with Peggy, right, in focus with his own light, right, in that little phone booth. And what's going on. He's calling her and telling her that I'll never see you again. I don't know how he's making up this excuse. But what an incredibly brilliant idea to actually not have that scene on camera and have that phone call, and it would have been a dramatic sequence, right, between, Peggy and Fred, and Peggy crying. But instead, it's played so subtly, just in the background there, and it's going on. Of course, Al knows what, is going on. And so there's just so much happening in the sequence. I just think it's extraordinary. Next one, please. Okay. Oh, yeah. So this is, wait a second, where are we now? Oh, so the soda jerk, right. So this, of course, is the soda jerk scene where Homer's being insulted by this man. And again, this was a very important part of what was going on in America, too, is that there were people who believed in sort of a more isolationist, approach, that somehow this had all been done, was a waste of time. Remember, there were a lot of people who were very afraid of communism. Communism was starting to become the big enemy. And of course, we sort of fought on the side together with Russia in the war. So very interesting. And in fact, I think originally there was even an anti-Semitic comment as well. But this was actually a scene that happened to William Wyler himself. And he wound up punching out a guy and almost got court-martialed when he was in the army because of some anti-Semitic comments that were being made. The next one, please, is so this, again, I don't know what to say about this scene. First of all, the scene almost never happened, again, because of the production code. To have two single people in a bedroom together, taking off pajamas, that was just, unheard of. But they allowed it to go through. They recognized it for what it was. When Homer, talks about, I'm independent as a baby that doesn't know how to get anything but to cry for it. And, the whole idea of a man who could never, touch his wife or make love to her with his hands, and to be so dependent on the woman. And I don't know. And even in the beginning of this scene where he goes down for the milk and you see Wilma outside, the shadow outside the door, and the build up to it, I don't know. It brought tears to my eyes. I just thought it was just an amazing sequence. Next scene, please. Yeah. So this is, of course, the this Air Force scrapyard, and they shot this in Ontario, California. This was actually really happening. These planes were real planes. There was no CGI here. These planes were being taken apart. And later on, used for scrap and for building. Great crane shots, tracking shots, zoom shots, absolutely extraordinary scene. In fact, that graveyard became a subdivision. And then perhaps one of the most powerful moments when Fred gets into the cockpit, right? The next slide, please. And I thought this was, again, handled so, with such a sophistication, because, a lot's going on here, obviously. And maybe it's being oversimplified in that, he goes through his traumatic experience again. And then, but we don't do cutaways to bomb dropping. It's not done in a sense, in a sensuous way. It's a little bit of sound effects, maybe at most. But really trying to get at, again, the deeper trauma of what is trauma, how the trauma affected these men, and how difficult it was for them to move past it. And perhaps, a little simplistic that somehow this experience of being in the cockpit again, now he's going to be better, but certainly the indication is that somehow this experience has made a difference to him. And then, of course, when he hears the voice, you're up there. And then, of course, the reality was when he comes down and, he does get a job and, working with the junk men and going to get involved in building or some kind of construction, because that's where a lot of the jobs were. And there was obviously enormous, building that went on in the late 40s and early 50s. And these planes were turned into prefabricated houses, and so there was sort of a, something kind of a little beautiful about all that. Next slide, please. And now, of course, we have the wedding. And again, look at the fabulous composition, right? So, we see the wedding, we see Wilma's, we see Fred looking at Peggy and Peggy looking at Fred. We also get to watch, of course, Al and Myrna Loy, and what's going on with them and the parents. I mean, I just think this is, again, just beautiful. And the whole way this was done, it ends in a very, very beautiful romantic way. Next slide, please. And of course, everybody congratulating them. And here we go. Not a big deal. They don't, again, not played for overly sentimental or overly maudulent, but we know that these two, Fred and Peggy, are meant to be together and always will be together. And then the last shot, this is the Academy Awards. Won 7 Academy Awards. Actually, though, they say 9. So Sam Goldwyn is on the far left and Harold Russell in the middle and the director, William Wyler. And the reason it was 9 awards was because Harold Russell did get 2 awards for his performance. And also coincidentally, that was the year that Samuel Goldwyn was being given the Irving Thalberg Honorary Award for his career. So he wound up getting 2 awards that night, and there were a total of 9 awards that were offered. So anyhow, I'm sorry, I feel like I've been rushing along, but so much here to talk about. But I'd love to hear some of your thoughts and questions now. So what do we got to talk about, Jeff? First of all, what about your questions or comments? Anything?
Just a couple of things. First of all, I wanted to let everyone know that what it was up against that year was Henry V, It's a Wonderful Life, The Razor's Edge, and The Yearling. And those are great movies, but this movie knocked me out, Fred. I'm so glad that you recommended that we watch this. I know you're a big William Wyler fan, and I can understand why. He's a genius. Can you comment on what were his movies like prior to the war? Did this obviously had a huge effect on him?
Well, I think this film in particular had a huge effect on him. I think he went on, of course, to make, all sorts of movies. And of course, people do forget that he directed Funny Girl, which is a fantastic movie. And Barbra Streisand won an Academy Award for that. And so it wasn't like he suddenly only made, dark or drama, dark drama movies. But he was always like that. He was always a director who, and maybe that's why he's not considered an auteur in the way some of the others have, where they had, like John Ford did the Westerns, and he really did everything. And, but always brought to it this kind of consummate professionalism and everything else. And if anything, is probably best known for his work with actors, especially young actresses like Audrey Hepburn, who had never been in a film and won an Academy Award for Roman Holiday and films like that. But no, I can't say that I think it overly, it just completely changed his. But Mrs. Miniver and Best Years of Our Lives are, in my opinion, his 2 greatest films.
Great, thank you. I also happened to notice there was, I'm wondering if you could clarify, there's a point at the beginning of the film where they're in the cockpit and Homer is going to light the match, and he asks if they're superstitious and maybe he should light a different match for the third one. Do you know what that was about? Yeah,
of course. There's no 3 on a match because the third guy got killed. the sniper, the German sniper, was watching them, and he could, see the match get lit, and then he could bring his gun up and be ready for this. And by the third guy, he was sure to get plugged. So you couldn't have three on a match. If you've ever heard that expression, that's where I'm not even sure it originated in World War II. It probably came from a war before that. But
well, thanks for clarifying that. And just on a personal note, I might say I watched this movie about 3 times, and years ago saw it. And I think, if anyone was to be vilified, people might say that it was Marie. But I found, like you mentioned earlier, I had a lot of affection for her point of view and what she must have been going through as she's losing a bit of her independence and identity with her husband coming back.
Yeah, I mean, we're telling it from Fred's point of view, but turn it around. What was her expectation? She marries this wonderful guy, and he comes back, and he wants to have this life, and so it's sad. But there was a lot of tragedy, very real tragedy. But again, although you could call this a melodrama, it certainly was a melodrama, it never got into that maudlin kind of sentimentality that we've seen other movies fall into. And that's what I admire so much about the direction and the performances.
Well, let's go to some of the comments and questions. First of all, Michel Maisonneuve, just a comment, and that was saw the field of broken planes and Freddie walking through them, tears, abandoned planes and abandoned soldiers tossed aside when no longer needed. Really well put.
Very beautiful, Michelle. But again, also hope, because the realization that these broken planes were going to become the prefab houses that many of these servicemen were able to buy. And in fact, my experience growing up in New York, that's how these houses got made and kind of started a whole new energy in America that was very important. So it was tragic, certainly at the moment, but there's also something even more going on in this imagery that I really find somewhat inspiring.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great comment. From Jeff Duncanson, it was more of a comment. If anyone can watch the putting Homer to bed scene and not be moved, they must have a ball bearing for a heart. Well said, Jeff.
And Courtney too. I mean, these are not professional actors. These are people, just living in their parts. And it really shows you sometimes, I think, what happens in movies, because there's so many great actors, and Meryl Streep, and all these people, and Jack Nicholson, and they play these great characters and with their accents and their quirks, but sometimes it's just simple people saying simple things with truth and emotion. It's so much more powerful. And I think it's a great reminder, and it's sort of sad we've kind of gotten away from that. I mean, there are a few directors who still do things like this, but for the most part, you would never see this in a big Hollywood, studio movie, this kind of, acting and behavior.
When Harold Russell was cleaning the gun and right before he smashes the window, I was looking him up on IMDb thinking, what else did he do after this? And there's really nothing. And it just blows my mind.
He didn't have a terribly exciting life. And in fact, there's one little tragic part of the story, which is he actually sold one of his Oscar statues, which, is not supposed to ever be done. That's not, it's completely forbidden, but he did. He was desperate for money and whatever. And
I believe it's for his wife's medical expenses is what I.
Yeah, but you're not supposed to sell your Oscar statue no matter what.
He had stiff competition that year too. He was up against Charles Coburn, William Demarest, Clifton Webb, and one of my all-time favorites, Claude Rains in Notorious. So,
yeah, Notorious. I mean, these are amazing movies, but something happened with this film, and it captured not just the public and the box office and the critics, but the Hollywood itself. And I think there was a lot of pride in being able to show that Hollywood could do more than just entertainment, that there was something. And I've said this before, to me, the greatest movies are the ones that actually did more than just entertain, but that actually provided some kind of sustenance to the audience and inspired them, or, gave them something to think about and commented on human condition and on life. And when films do that, as well as entertain, that's just extraordinary. And of course, this was a very specific time and place in the history of America, and I'm sure Canada as well. I'm sure many of these things were going on in Canada too. And And now we watch this 60, 80 years later or something. It's absolutely amazing that it was captured, and I don't know if people are studying, this in the university anymore, but I would be showing people this film so they could really understand the human essence of what was happening, not just the, who won what war, and what territories they gained or lost. And so much is focused on that kind of intellectual history instead of really about the people themselves.
Now, earlier on, you asked about the title of the movie, and
yeah,
a handful of
okay. Let's hear what people have.
Of course, Barry Bender and Barbara Maisonneuve both recognized immediately that Marie is the one that uttered that famous line.
Yes,
I'd like to read a comment from Mrs. Maisonneuve. Thought it ironic that the most frivolous character, Marie, is the one who said the line, "I gave you the best years of my life," which illustrated that it was the case for both the troops and those left behind.
So the best years of their lives were before they went to the war? Is that what she's saying when she says, saying, "I gave you the best years of my life"?
Yes, that illustrated that this was the case for both the troops and those left behind. That she gave those years, and the years that he was away, those were probably some of the best years of her life. She should have really been truly living.
But were they the best years of his life? There were a lot of people like my father who thought the army was the best thing that ever happened to him. Now, fortunately, he didn't see combat, but he was, 18, 19, went into the army. And when he came, as he said, a boy, and when I came out, I was a man. And the GI Bill paid for him to go to university and allowed him to buy his first house. And his memory of the war was, a very, very positive one. And then some people think that this is actually, the best years of our lives are what happened after the war, right? And coming back. So it's a very interesting title. I don't know what, I think, great titles obviously have more than one meaning, right?
Right. Yes, absolutely. And of course, we have another point of view. And from an anonymous attendee, Fred asked for ideas about the title. "My father and his high school class all signed up from a small prairie town. Without the war, they probably would not have seen the world, mixed with other classes, prolonged teen years, and become professionals with middling grades."
Yeah. So very, very different than we think about, And remember, they weren't being drafted. They were enlisting. They were going because they knew this was important and that this was something they had to do. And I think they did it with their eyes open, much more so than World War I, because obviously there had been World War I. And I can't even imagine what that feeling would be. I don't know anybody today who feels that way about their country or about joining the armed forces to serve their country, and that the meaning of what we're trying to do, in America and Canada is so important that we should be enforcing this on other people. It's a very, very different world today.
To Margarita D'Antunano, thank you for your question. Poignant, magnificent movie. My husband's dad and father were veterans, and he knows well about the trauma after the war. How accurate do you think the movie portrays the lack of support for veterans? It was rather heartbreaking.
I don't know, obviously. I think there was some support. Obviously, with Truman, this was a big deal, the GI Bill. I mean, this was on the scale of what's happening now in America, with the emergency relief funds for COVID. They really had to drag America out of the war and into a period of enormous prosperity, which was, the early 50s and really the great, this was probably the greatest economic growth period in American history. So there was some very positive things being done. But I do believe that there was a lack of understanding of what trauma really was, and how, it's sort of like, Marie said, well, why you just stop thinking about that, and let's just go have a party, and as if this was something that that was trivial or they could control, and we know that that's not true. And so I don't know how realistic or not. I think they absolutely tried very hard, especially that's why they had three characters to show that each individual was going to have their own experience. And some were going to be positive and some were not. And they were all going to be different. And of course, Homer's, of course, turns out to be quite wonderful, but I don't really know anything about the statistics. I know obviously alcoholism increased. I know unemployment was a huge, huge problem, for the returning servicemen. And again, I just can't imagine after living, as William Wyler himself says, after living in reality where, people you're with are going to die tomorrow. What does life mean anymore? How important is that I get a new car or not? It must have been really, really difficult.
In terms of, Jeffrey Eden asked, whatever happened to Teresa Wright? She was great in this, Little Foxes, and especially Shadow of a Doubt, which I agree, Jeffrey. I love her in that.
Teresa Wright had a fantastic career. And in fact, she won several Emmys later on in the 80s and, doing some great roles. And in fact, I actually got to work with her. She was in a movie I produced called John Grisham's The Rainmaker with Matt Damon. And Teresa Wright was Birdie, the old lady who Matt Damon rents his little apartment above the garage. And so I got to meet her and she told a few stories. And she was quite old at the time. I think she was probably 80 or something, but beautiful, still absolutely, a beautiful woman. And but again, so she did have a very successful and long career.
Yeah, thanks for that, Fred. Michelle Maisonneuve again has a great question. You have great insights on alternate casting choices. Were there any for this film, Fred?
You know what? That's a great question, and actually, I don't believe there were. I think these choices of Sam Goldwyn's and William Wyler's were pretty much what they wanted. I don't think there's anybody who said no to this film. This was a unique opportunity. People kind of got it. William Wyler, of course, was the top 3-4 directors in the world at the time, and everybody was excited to see what he would do, in his first film back from being in the war. And I can't recall any conversations. I'm sure there were some, about different people, but again, and then of course the people, were under contract to Goldwyn, they certainly were going to do what he wanted them done, Virginia Mayo and Dana Andrews. And I think there was some concern that Fredric March was a little old for the part, but I think they considered some people who were younger, but you don't say no to Fredric March,
Yeah, he was spectacular in this. Doug Baker, in terms of race relations in America during the 1940s and after the war, he points out that he noticed several scenes in the movie where Black Americans were shown in the background, possibly being served in department stores. Was Wyler making a comment about how race relations?
That's a great question, because the whole issue of race relations was a huge issue, especially, a sophisticated man like William Wyler. And as I said, he did weave in commentary about commercialism and other things into this story. But I really think he was avoiding that question, because it was such a huge issue, a much bigger issue than anything else we're really, kind of talking about in a way. And I did notice that as well. And I think it was intentional, obviously, to cast, Black extras in different parts, but it was pretty subtle. And I think, again, intentionally kind of avoided, because otherwise you would have really had to, address it in an appropriate way. And there just wasn't time with everything else going on in this film.
Jeff Duncanson, again, thank you. I love the way the film approaches the romances. They're very adult and honest. There's the feeling that the happy endings are not slam dunks. They know they'll have to work at it.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a great comment, that, it's not just Hollywood. And I think it's particularly interesting, the subtlety of the relationship of Al and his wife, and Myrna Loy, because they're really going to have to work on it. He's an alcoholic. This guy's got problems, And in fact, there's that wonderful scene with their daughter, with Teresa Wright, where she says, "Oh, you're always so happy," and Merle gives her the little speech about, believe me, we're not always so happy, the fighting and the stuff that we've gone through in our lives, and so I think it was very mature and very adult in that presentation, and certainly Peggy and Fred were going to have their challenges. Homer actually remember, he was getting $200 a month for disability, for the rest of his life. That was a fortune in those days. So, and he had this woman who was just, so madly in love with him, and these wonderful parents. And so maybe that's the one kind of Hollywood ending. But I think you're right. In general, this was done in a very mature, kind of the way you'd expect in a novel, in a great novel or a great play, and, not the typical Hollywood stuff at all.
No, it was quite refreshing. Our anonymous attendee mentions Marie, and that, do you think at the time she would have been looked at as a villainous character in the movie at all, or compared to
well,
the other?
I think maybe, except she was Virginia Mayo. So that helped a little bit, because she was a well-loved character and a well-loved actress. So there was, she started out with a little bit of sympathy from the audience, because they knew who she was, and they could see the role she was cast in. And certainly when he comes back and there's this guy in the apartment, and but it's so obvious she's just lying to him. And also you see what joy she has when they go out dancing, and then there's that wonderful scene where they take the picture at the table and she's gone to sit with the other guy. And then you have, Peggy and Fred just kind of like, staring, and they don't know what to think or say. They're both so yeah, I don't know. I mean, and again, Marie, she had a job. She was working at a nightclub. She was probably having a great life. And he comes home and says, no, you're not allowed to work anymore.
Yeah.
What's that all about, right? And he didn't even have a job.
Well, I thought it was really incredible how she was trying to associate him with that uniform. She loved how he looked in it, and this meant something. Of course, the ribbons and the acclaim. She forced him to put it back on before they went back out in the night of the town, and he really bristled at that. He didn't want that to be how he associated himself, and yet when things are really falling apart for him, he goes back to that bomber, because that's where at least he has some idea of what his purpose was, at least before the war.
I think it was somewhat coincidental. He was there because he was going to leave, but he had the courage to go back into that, into the bomb thing and sit there, and knowing what was going to happen. I mean, that was a very brave, and he really actively was trying to address what he knew he had to address, or he would never be able to marry Peggy or move on with his life. And as he comes out there, he gets a job and is ready, I'll do anything, and suddenly you get this feeling that something has been shed, and he's going to move forward with his life. Struggles still, but he'll move forward.
Indeed. And I think a last note, I'm going to go back to Michel Maisonneuve. I think some still join for service to the country, but we also do not promote it enough, especially in Canada. Ask not what your country, in the quotations. Afghanistan changed that somewhat.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I was being a little flippant before. I think that it's just much more complex now than it used to be. And I think that there's a lot of different messages coming out of the media, perhaps coming out of the armed forces themselves, and in terms of what your role will be, what the importance will be. I think there's still probably many, many young men who joining the Army in Canada is a fantastic opportunity for them. And they grow up and they see the world and they learn skills and they learn how to, work with others and collaborate. And so, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say it's not important anymore. The comment I was just saying is I think that back at that period of time when World War II was beginning, and we already had seen all of the damage that was happening in England and everywhere else. And of course, we still didn't join the war until Pearl Harbor, right? And to this day, who knows what would have happened at, Pearl Harbor, because that was not the plan, was to, join the war the next day. But I think that's a really good point. And of course, it's a much more complicated world that we live in today. And I think there's some wonderful films, by the way, that have been made, since then, about these experiences. The one that really comes to mind, of course, is Coming Home, the great John Voight movie. Who directed that? Hal Ashby?
Hal Ashby, yeah.
Yeah. That's a wonderful film, a more contemporary film about, the challenges of actors. I mean, the challenges of veterans coming home.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great pairing, definitely, between these two films, Fred. Thank you for that.
And of course, talking about racial issues, maybe that's a good segue to our next film.
Yes. Yeah, I'm very excited. First of all, thank you for passing the baton over to me for next week, Fred. You get to rest a little bit for all your hard work that you put in. But next week, we're going to fast forward by about 2 decades and explore the Deep South in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s with 1967's In the Heat of the Night, directed by Canada's own Norman Jewison. And of course, starring Oscar Award winners Rod Steiger, Sidney Poitier as Mr. Virgil Tibbs. Though this film's from over 50 years ago, it's tackling themes of racial division, police and political corruption, poverty and violence, all as if it was taken out of the headlines from the past 10 months. And in addition, this socially relevant commentary also manages to entertain its audience with a murder mystery. And at times it's got some very comedic moments, I think. So I hope you'll join us here again next week for In the Heat of the Night.
And again, remarkable that this picture won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Because this, again, was a movie that is not just light entertainment. And Norman Jewison was not just a very talented director, but a very committed political, person. And I think it just, I didn't intend this, when we first picked the films. But when you think about Best Year and In the Heat, and then of course our final film, Midnight Cowboy, these are all films that had enormous social impact. They were made with great intention to influence an audience and affect an audience, and they succeeded both commercially and critically to do that. So, and these are, again, not the ones you normally think about when you think about Academy Award Best Pictures. So, but I hadn't really thought about how most of these do have this kind of social impact quality too. So really looking forward to hearing your thoughts, Jeff, and hope you can all join us. And of course, we still have some film clubs going and other things going on. So you can rent the theater now, only 10 people, but hopefully we'll open up soon. So again, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
This is brilliant, Fred. Thanks so much. Good night, everybody.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.